I know everyone has short attention spans, especially on social media. But I've gotten a lot of people, again, sending the account different videos and lots of messages of concerned families about what it could mean for their children's fundamental disability and educational rights with some of the things that are proposed. I want to share this resource. As always, it's one of my favorites. It's the parentcenterhub.org. This is part of the federal funding for educating families with disabilities. Everyone has access to a parent information center. And again, this is federally funded. You will see if you look into your states or territories resourcing that, of course, that's going to vary depending on if it's supplemented by state resources or not. So those states that don't fund public education as high don't have as wide of resources, but the federal funding for these sites at least gives a bare minimum of information for families, and there are just a ton of good webinars and things understanding special education law, special education rights, how to advocate, how to understand the different parts of IDEA, parts in particular C, which is early intervention, part B, which is ages 3 to 21. You can find all this information right there on, finding your local one. I'm in Michigan. Ours is my local one in Southeast Michigan is called the Michigan Alliance for Families. It's incredible. Through the funding of the Department of Education in our state, we have parent mentors. And in my own experience, we did not understand the different parts of transitioning from 0 to 3, 3 to 5, K through 12. And connecting in with that organization was fundamentally helpful to making sure that our child had his rights and services implemented according to his identified needs. And just a quick education about Part C and Part B. So Part C is early intervention. There is currently no set standard of who qualifies for this other than kids that are at risk for disabilities or identified with developmental challenges. Qualification really is, they put it at the state level, which, does not build equity, as we see with our families who get denied despite having delays in their children from HIE. Some states, obviously, that fund education more are going to have better services. They're going to have better qualifications. And this is where advocacy, rubber meets the road in both local and national advocacy. Part B moves from a strength-based model of harnessing development to a deficit-based model, and not just a deficit-based model for ages 3 to 21, but also services that you got that might feel like an outpatient clinical service in 0 to 3, PT, OT, speech, all of that, which again, the frequency really depends on your child's needs and funding for those positions. When you move to Part B, ages 3 to 21, it is a deficit-based model. And then it's also how do the goals are more focused on how your child engages with its school environment, with their school environment. And so it's not going to be on like the medical-based PT or OT or speech. It's going to be on how can we build in function for this child to engage in their community and in their school environment. And that is something that I think a lot of people do not realize because they have not gone through a lot of the training. They have not connected with these patient information centers and other local resources with their school districts or their state to understand how this process all works. And it is overwhelming. It's a lot. So this 3 to 21, these are key components of your child's educational rights. FAPE, free and appropriate public education. Before IDEA and the Department of Education and the Office of Special Education within the Department of Education, people were not required to service kids with disabilities. They just weren't. So that's why the disability rights movement, if you look at the history of that, of why these things have been established and funding, granted to it, and albeit it's never been fully funded. And you can look into why and who has stopped that over the years or have cut federal funding for education. The history is all there. Feel free to read up on it. But FAPE is what protects our kids to actually be able to have an education instead of being sent to institutions or being kept home. IEPs, individualized education programs. Obviously, this is all about, tailoring the services and accommodations to the child's needs to access their curriculum and access their school environment. So that looks different depending on the child. Least restrictive environment was put in, so that way our kids aren't just shuttered behind closed doors in some random school, and they actually have federal rights to attend for instance, their local school, the closest to your home, so you don't have to necessarily shuttle your kid 2 hours away to a special school. Least restrictive environment means that they have rights to engaging with their typical peers. Which is really important when we talk about inclusion and decreasing stigma. And so when you talk about ableism, when you hide kids behind closed doors in communities, ableism gets worse. So if you look into the disability rights movement, this is a key component and why there are federal protections and federal grievance structures, because if you trust all the local and state people to do the best by kids, it wasn't happening. And so that's why we have this structure. Procedural safeguards, which is what you have, the rights your child and you have to elevate concerns beyond the school district. If your school district is not serving your child, you have a stack. Everyone gets this very overwhelming stack of procedural safeguards, okay? But that is the process protection for due process protection for children and parents, right? So you have due process, and it is a pain in the ass to go through. So I'm just going to put that out there. But you have those rights. Without this entity and without the funding and without the resources through IDEA and the enforcement of it, you do not have that. Transition services. So this is when kids are approaching ending high school, which is traditionally around age 18. And these services, as you saw, are federally given to people with disabilities, children with disabilities through age 21. Transition services are really important as these start around 16, to look at what is in the future, and then looking at the other parts of IDEA that help ensure if a child grows up to be an adult and goes to higher education, that there are protections for 504 and IDEA until age 21 for IDEA, and 504 protects further along the lifespan. So people, when we talk about employment for people with disabilities, this is like a passion of my cousin who has CP. He has had a continuous job with spastic quad CP for the last, decade and a half. And he's one of 1 in 10 do have jobs, meaning 9 out of 10 do not. And so he's been able to do that because of many of the protections afforded through education and through IDEA and 504. And just to follow this up, the IDEA funding gap that we know. So the government promised when they put IDEA into law that the government would contribute 40% of the cost of educating students with disabilities, approximately 13 to 15%. And if you look at proposed cuts, this continues to impact. We have a teacher shortage in this country. We have a special education teacher shortage in this country because people can't afford to stay in these roles. They've been demonized, certainly, in many cases, and they are burnt out. And we have a significant issue with keeping teachers. So if you don't fund it, and funding for special education teachers, training special education teachers, if you're not funding that at the bare minimum level, then you're going to have continued gaps. Again, under the Department of Education is the OCR and OSER. So that's the Office of Civil Rights and Office of Special Education Rights. And so they provide guidance on these federal laws, landmark cases that go all the way up to the Supreme Court. They will write guidance documents on and disseminate that to states and local education agencies. So you see LEA, it's local education agency. And again, how those structures are really varies by state. So these legal protections and rights, the DOE has these departments under it for ADA. So need to be aware that that's where those are. And just lastly, I just covered very quickly, even though it's 10 minutes, about this. This doesn't even cover Title I or Title IX or any of those other protections for, equity and non-discrimination.